December 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A German officer crouches in a frozen foxhole, listening to something that makes his blood run cold. It's not the sound of American artillery, or the rumble of tanks. No, it's something far more terrifying. It's the sound of American machine guns firing continuously for minutes at a time, without stopping. The German officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where every single bullet had to be rationed, where soldiers were court-martialed for wasting ammunition, does the math in his head and realizes something impossible. The Americans are firing more ammunition in 1 hour than his entire division was allocated for a week. He turns to his subordinate and says, with a mixture of disbelief and horror, "They shoot at everything. They waste bullets like water, like they have infinite supplies." His subordinate nods grimly and says, "Herr Oberstleutnant, what if they do? What if they actually do have infinite supplies?" That moment right there marked the psychological beginning of the end for the German military. Because what this officer was witnessing wasn't American wastefulness. It was American industrial might turned into a weapon. And it was about to crush the Third Reich under an avalanche of steel and lead. This is the untold story of how unlimited ammunition became America's secret weapon in World War II. To understand why German commanders were so shocked by American ammunition usage, we need to understand the world they came from. See, the German military in World War II was built on a foundation of scarcity. From the very beginning of the Nazi rearmament program in the 1930s, Germany faced critical shortages of raw materials. They had limited access to copper for bullet casings, limited access to lead for projectiles, and most critically, they had virtually no domestic oil production, which meant every resource had to be carefully rationed and strategically allocated. This created a military culture where conservation was drilled into every soldier. From day one, German soldiers were taught to fire in short, controlled bursts to make every bullet count, to avoid suppressive fire unless absolutely necessary, and to always think about ammunition as a precious, limited resource that might not be resupplied. German officers were trained in military academies where logistics was taught as the art of doing more with less, where clever tactics and superior training were supposed to compensate for material shortages. This wasn't just military doctrine, it was a national philosophy, born from Germany's experience in World War I, when the British naval blockade had starved the country of resources and contributed to their defeat. So when German planners looked at war in the 1940s, they assumed every nation faced the same constraints they did. They assumed that ammunition would be scarce, that every army would have to carefully ration their supplies, that superior German training and tactical doctrine would overcome any material disadvantages they might face. But they were catastrophically wrong. Because while Germany was trying to conquer Europe on a shoestring budget, across the Atlantic Ocean, something unprecedented in human history was happening. The United States was transforming itself into what historians would later call the arsenal of democracy. And the scale of this transformation was so massive, so beyond anything the world had ever seen, that German commanders literally could not comprehend it, even when they saw it with their own eyes. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. That's billion with a B. To put that in perspective, if you tried to count to 47 billion, counting one number per second without sleeping or eating, it would take you over 1,400 years. American production of artillery shells exceeded 1 billion rounds. American production of bullets exceeded the entire combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy by a factor of 3 to 1. But these numbers, as staggering as they are, don't capture the real story. The real story is what happened when this production met warfare, when unlimited ammunition encountered limited German resources. Because what American commanders discovered was that ammunition itself could become a weapon, not just what it fired at, but the sheer overwhelming abundance of it could break enemy morale, destroy enemy tactics, and fundamentally change the nature of warfare itself. And this realization, this weaponization of abundance, is what German commanders were about to experience and what would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In 1941 and 1942, when German forces were still winning victories across Europe and the Soviet Union, German officers viewed American military doctrine with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Intelligence reports from North Africa, where American forces first engaged German troops in late 1942 and early 1943, described American tactical behavior in terms that German staff officers found laughable. The Americans, they reported, used suppressive fire constantly. They fired at suspected enemy positions rather than confirmed targets. They called in artillery barrages that consumed thousands of shells to destroy targets that a well-trained German unit might neutralize with a few dozen rounds. One German after-action report from Tunisia in early 1943 described an engagement where American forces expended an estimated 10,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition and 500 artillery shells to dislodge a German position that held fewer than 50 men. The German officer, writing the report, noted with satisfaction that his unit had inflicted casualties on the Americans while suffering minimal losses themselves, and had only expended approximately 800 rounds of ammunition in the entire engagement. He concluded the report with an assessment that would be repeated throughout German military channels. The Americans rely on material superiority to compensate for inferior training and tactical doctrine. They waste ammunition on a scale that reveals their lack of military discipline. When faced with determined resistance and forced to fight under conditions of supply scarcity, American units will collapse. This assessment seemed to be confirmed in the early North African campaigns. American units did sometimes falter when supply lines were disrupted. American commanders did rely heavily on artillery support, and American infantry did fire vastly more ammunition per engagement than their German counterparts. German tactical doctrine, which emphasized marksmanship, fire discipline, and aggressive maneuver, seemed superior to American methods, which German officers dismissively called the brute force approach. But what German commanders failed to understand was that they weren't observing American weakness, they were observing American doctrine, a doctrine that was being deliberately designed around one fundamental advantage that Germany could never match: the ability to deliver unlimited ammunition to the front lines. See, American military planners in 1942 and 1943 had done something that seems obvious in retrospect, but was actually revolutionary. They had looked at American industrial capacity, looked at American logistical capabilities, and asked a simple question. What if we designed our tactics around the assumption that ammunition would never be scarce? What if instead of training soldiers to conserve ammunition, we trained them to use it decisively? What if we made ammunition itself a casualty-preventing measure? The idea was simple in its brutality. Every bullet fired at a potential enemy position was a bullet that might save an American life. It didn't matter if the position was occupied or not. It didn't matter if you were shooting at shadows or confirmed targets. The psychological effect of overwhelming firepower, the physical effect of suppressing enemy movement, the tactical effect of forcing the enemy to keep their heads down, all of these things reduced American casualties. And when you have unlimited ammunition, the mathematics becomes simple. More bullets equals fewer dead Americans. This doctrine, which would later be formalized as the American way of war, had a name that German commanders would come to dread. They called it steel, not blood. The idea that you could trade steel and explosives for human lives. That you could use material superiority to minimize casualties. And this doctrine was about to be tested on a scale that would shock the world. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Normandy invasion and German forces defending the Atlantic Wall are about to get their first taste of what unlimited American ammunition really means. In the weeks following the invasion, German commanders send increasingly frantic reports back to headquarters, and the tone of these reports shifts from confidence to confusion to something approaching panic. One report from a Wehrmacht unit defending near Caen describes an American attack that began with a naval bombardment that lasted 45 minutes and expended more shells than the German unit had fired in the previous 3 months of combat.
This was followed by an airstrike involving over 100 bombers, then an artillery barrage from American howitzers that the German report estimates consumed over 10,000 shells in 2 hours. Then American infantry advanced behind a wall of machine gun and rifle fire that the German officer describes as unceasing. Only after this massive expenditure of ammunition did American forces actually close with German positions, and by that point, as the report notes, German defenders were so suppressed, so psychologically shattered by the bombardment that organized resistance was nearly impossible. Another report from July 1944 describes something that German tactical doctrine had no answer for. American infantry units were calling in artillery strikes on individual buildings, on single machine gun nests, on suspected sniper positions. The forward observer attached to American infantry units had radio communication with artillery batteries miles behind the lines and could deliver pinpoint fire missions within minutes, consuming hundreds of shells to eliminate threats that German doctrine would have required infantry to assault directly. One German company commander wrote, "It is impossible to establish a defensive position because the moment we open fire, the Americans locate us, and within minutes artillery shells rain down in such quantities that the position becomes untenable. We are not fighting infantry, we are fighting an artillery park that happens to have infantry attached to it." But the psychological impact went even deeper than tactical frustration. German soldiers began to understand that they were facing an enemy that simply did not care about ammunition conservation in ways that violated everything they had been taught about warfare. Captured German soldiers in late 1944 reported that one of the most demoralizing aspects of combat against American forces was the sound of constant firing. American machine gunners would fire long bursts, 50 or 100 rounds at suspected positions. American riflemen would fire at anything that moved. American artillery would respond to the smallest provocation with overwhelming fire missions. And this constant expenditure of ammunition created a psychological effect that German commanders had not anticipated. It made German soldiers feel hunted. It made them feel like the enemy had unlimited resources and that no matter how well they fought, no matter how cleverly they maneuvered, no matter how disciplined their fire control, they would eventually be buried under an avalanche of American steel. One German soldier captured in France in August 1944 told his American interrogators, "You don't fight like soldiers, you fight like gangsters. You see something move, you shoot at it. You think you see something, you shoot at it. You want to advance, you shoot at everything first and then you advance. It's not warfare, it's just violence. It's just endless violence." And the interrogator noted in his report, the prisoner seemed more psychologically disturbed by American ammunition expenditure than by the prospect of being captured. This observation would be repeated in hundreds of prisoner interrogations throughout 1944 and 1945. German soldiers were not primarily afraid of American tactical skill or American bravery, they were afraid of American ammunition. And this fear was entirely justified because the reality of American logistics in 1944 was even more overwhelming than German soldiers imagined. The average American infantry division in combat in Northwest Europe in late 1944 was supplied with approximately 5,000 tons of supplies per day, of which roughly 2,000 tons was ammunition. By comparison, a German infantry division defending in the same theater was lucky to receive 500 tons of supplies per day total. American artillery battalions were allocated scales that assumed they would fire approximately 500 rounds per gun per day. German artillery battalions were allocated scales that assumed they would fire perhaps 10 rounds per gun per day. And this disparity only grew worse as the war continued. By December 1944, when Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, German commanders knew they were facing an ammunition disparity that made victory impossible. But they attacked anyway because they had no choice. And what happened next would become the final proof that unlimited ammunition had become an American war-winning weapon. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest in Germany launches Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, its final desperate gamble in the West. The goal is ambitious. Punch through American lines, race to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. German planners know this is a long shot, but they believe they have one advantage: surprise and initial momentum. What they don't know is that they are about to run headfirst into the full force of American industrial might, turned into a weapon of war. The offensive begins well. German forces achieve tactical surprise. They push American units back. They capture strategic crossroads. And for a few days, it looks like German tactical skill might overcome American material advantages. But then something happens that changes everything. American logistics kicks into high gear, and the flow of ammunition to the front becomes a flood that drowns German offensive capability. Within 48 hours of the German attack, American supply officers have redirected the entire logistical system of the European theater to support the defense of the Bulge. Truck convoys that were carrying food and winter clothing are emptied and refilled with ammunition. Artillery shells that were stockpiled for future offensives are rushed to the Ardennes. Small arms ammunition that was sitting in depots in England is loaded onto planes and flown directly to forward airfields. The scale of this logistics operation is staggering. In the first week of the Battle of the Bulge, American forces in the Ardennes received more ammunition than the entire German army on the Western Front expended in the entire month of December. American artillery units are told not to worry about ammunition conservation. If they see a target, they are to fire on it immediately and keep firing until the target is destroyed. American infantry units are resupplied with ammunition multiple times per day. Some units are receiving fresh ammunition every 6 hours. And the effect on German forces is devastating. One German officer, captured during the battle, later described what it was like to face this wall of fire. He said, "We would begin an attack, and immediately American artillery would open fire. Not scattered fire, not targeted fire, but massive barrages that covered entire grid squares. We would try to maneuver to flank positions, and American machine guns would fire continuously, not in bursts, but continuously, as if they had infinite belts of ammunition. We would dig into defensive positions, and American infantry would call down artillery on us, even if we were just a squad of 10 men. They would expend hundreds of shells to eliminate 10 men. The officer paused in his interrogation and then said something that the American interrogator noted as particularly significant. He said, "You have to understand, we were not defeated by American tactics or American bravery. We were defeated by American factories. We were fighting your industrial capacity, and you cannot win a firefight against a factory." The mathematics of the Battle of the Bulge tell the story. By the time the battle ended in late January 1945, American forces in the Ardennes had expended approximately 32 million rounds of small arms ammunition and 1.7 million artillery shells in 6 weeks of combat. To put that in perspective, the entire German army on all fronts in the entire year of 1944 had expended approximately 950 million rounds of small arms ammunition. American forces, in one battle, in one theater, in 6 weeks, had expended more than 3% of what Germany had expended in an entire year of global warfare. And this was not an exception. This was the norm. American ammunition expenditure in the Battle of the Bulge was actually slightly below average for major American operations in late 1944 and early 1945. The spring offensives of 1945, when American forces crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany, would see even higher rates of ammunition consumption. But what made the Battle of the Bulge significant was that it was the last time German forces attempted a major offensive operation, and it demonstrated beyond any doubt that German tactical skill, German operational planning, and German soldier quality could not overcome American material superiority. The Germans had achieved surprise, they had concentrated their best remaining forces, they had attacked when weather grounded American air superiority, and they still been defeated. Crushed, not by superior American tactics, but by superior American ammunition. And this defeat marked a fundamental shift in how warfare would be understood going forward. Because what America had demonstrated in World War II was that if you have sufficient industrial capacity, you can design your entire military doctrine around the assumption of unlimited resources. And if you do that, you can reduce your own casualties while maximizing enemy casualties. You can trade steel for blood. And if you have enough steel, you can make warfare less about tactical brilliance and more about logistical capability. This realization would reshape American military doctrine for the next 80 years, but it would also create a problem, because while unlimited ammunition solved many tactical problems, it created new strategic questions that American commanders would struggle with for decades to come.
In the months after the German surrender in May 1945, American intelligence officers conducted extensive interviews with captured German military leaders, and one topic came up again and again in these interviews: the shock and psychological impact of American ammunition superiority. These were not young, inexperienced officers. These were Wehrmacht generals, men who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had commanded divisions and corps, who had decades of military experience. And in interview after interview, they described American ammunition usage in terms that mixed professional respect with something approaching existential horror. Generalmajor Friedrich von Mellenthin, who had served as chief of staff to several armored units in North Africa and Europe, was asked in his post-war interrogation what single factor had most surprised him about American military capability. He didn't mention American tanks or American aircraft or even American tactical doctrine. He said this: the Americans treated ammunition as a free resource. They fired artillery barrages that consumed in minutes what we would have considered a week's supply for an entire division. They used machine guns like garden hoses, spraying fire continuously rather than in disciplined bursts. The psychological effect on German soldiers was profound because it communicated that the Americans had resources so vast that they didn't need to think about conservation. When you're trying to conserve every bullet, and your enemy is firing thousands of bullets to kill a single soldier, it tells you that you have already lost the industrial war. Another officer, Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded units in France and later in Germany, described a specific incident that captured the disparity. He said his unit had established a defensive position outside a French village and was engaged by an American infantry company. Von Luck estimated that his unit of approximately 120 men expended perhaps 2,000 rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition in the engagement and successfully repulsed the initial American attack. But then American artillery opened fire. And according to von Luck's estimate, the Americans expended over 3,000 artillery shells on his position in less than an hour. The village was completely destroyed, his unit suffered 50% casualties, and when American infantry attacked again, his remaining men surrendered immediately. Von Luck said in the interrogation, "It was not a battle, it was an execution by artillery. We could not return fire because we were too suppressed. We could not retreat because we were too disorganized. All we could do was wait for the shells to stop falling and hope we survived." The Americans traded shells for German lives, and because they had unlimited shells, it was a trade they could always make. But perhaps the most revealing testimony came from Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, who had commanded German forces in the West during the Battle of the Bulge. When asked why the offensive had failed, Rundstedt gave an answer that surprised his interrogators. He said the offensive failed the moment American logistics responded. We had achieved tactical surprise, we had broken through American lines, we had created the conditions for exploitation. But then, American supply convoys began arriving at the front with ammunition, and suddenly, every American soldier had as much ammunition as he could fire, every American artillery battery had unlimited shells, every American position became a fortress of fire. Our tactical advantage disappeared within 48 hours because the Americans could resupply faster than we could advance. This was the fundamental lesson. We could not win a war of attrition against American industry. The interrogator pressed him. If you had known before the war about American industrial capacity, would you have advised against war with the United States? Von Rundstedt paused and then said, anyone who understood what American industry could do would never have recommended war with America. But we did not understand. We thought American soldiers were soft, that American tactics were crude, that American equipment was inferior. We were correct about some of these things. American soldiers in 1942 were not as experienced as German soldiers. American tactics in early engagements were often clumsy. But we failed to understand that experience and tactics matter very little when your enemy can afford to fire 10 bullets for every one of yours. When your enemy can call down artillery fire that consumes more resources in an hour than you have available in a week. When your enemy treats ammunition as if it costs nothing, then all of your tactical skill becomes irrelevant. These testimonies revealed something that American military planners had not fully appreciated during the war. The psychological impact of unlimited ammunition was almost as important as the physical impact. German soldiers and German commanders had built their entire understanding of warfare around the assumption of scarcity. When they encountered an enemy that operated under the assumption of abundance, it broke their will to fight in ways that tactical defeats alone could not. One captured German soldier told his interrogators, "We knew we were going to lose when we heard American machine guns firing continuously for hours at night, just at nothing, just at suspected positions, just to keep us afraid." The sound of American guns firing endlessly into the darkness, that was when we knew Germany had lost the war. This psychological dimension of unlimited ammunition would become a key part of American military doctrine going forward. But it also revealed a potential weakness. Because while unlimited ammunition worked against Germany, what would happen when America faced an enemy that also had industrial capacity, or an enemy that could fight asymmetrically, avoiding American firepower superiority? These questions would haunt American military planners in the decades after World War II. But in 1945, they were questions for the future. In 1945, the lesson was simple and devastating. American industry had won the war, and ammunition had been the weapon.
Now let's talk about the actual numbers, because when you see the raw data of American ammunition production compared to German production, the scale of the disparity becomes almost incomprehensible. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Germany in the same period produced approximately 15 billion rounds. That is a 3-to-1 advantage. But those raw numbers actually understate the real disparity, because they don't account for when the ammunition was produced or how it was distributed. American production ramped up massively in 1943 and 1944. By 1944, American factories were producing more small arms ammunition per month than Germany produced in an entire year of 1944. And because American logistics could actually deliver this ammunition to frontline troops, American soldiers had access to effectively unlimited ammunition in a way German soldiers never did. Artillery ammunition tells an even more stark story. The United States produced over 1 billion artillery shells during World War II. Germany produced approximately 300 million.
American production of heavy artillery shells, those 155mm and larger, exceeded German production of all artillery shells combined, including light and medium calibers. And again, this understates the real advantage, because American artillery shells were more likely to actually reach frontline units. American logistics meant that artillery batteries could expect regular resupply. German artillery batteries by late 1944 were often rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day because logistics could not keep up with even modest demand. But the real story is in what these numbers meant tactically. An American infantry division in combat in Northwest Europe in late 1944 typically had access to approximately 2,000 tons of ammunition per day. Most of this was artillery shells, but it also included millions of rounds of small arms ammunition. This meant that an American infantryman could fire his weapon liberally, could use suppressive fire, could spray bullets at suspected enemy positions without worrying about running out. An American artillery forward observer could call in fire missions on individual targets without worrying about ammunition conservation. An American machine gunner could fire long bursts continuously without being disciplined for wasting ammunition. Compare this to a German infantry division in the same period, which was lucky to receive 500 tons of total supplies per day, and much of that was food and fuel, not ammunition. German soldiers were explicitly trained to conserve ammunition. German machine gunners were taught to fire in short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds. German riflemen were expected to make aimed shots, not suppressive fire. German artillery batteries were given strict allocation limits and often could not respond to fire missions because they had no shells. This disparity extended to every level of ammunition consumption. American forces in the Battle of the Bulge, as we mentioned, expended 32 million rounds of small arms ammunition in 6 weeks. The entire German army on the Western Front in the same period expended approximately 12 million rounds. American artillery in the same battle fired 1.7 million shells. German artillery fired approximately 400,000. And this was for the German army's last major offensive, when they were supposed to have stockpiled supplies for the operation. Even when German commanders tried to hoard ammunition for major operations, they could not match American expenditure rates in routine combat operations. But perhaps the most telling number is this. By early 1945, the average American infantryman carried approximately 80 rounds of rifle ammunition into combat and could expect to be resupplied within hours if he expended it. The average German infantryman carried approximately 60 rounds and could not expect resupply for days or weeks. This meant that American infantry could fight continuously, could engage in sustained firefights, could use their weapons as liberally as tactical situation demanded. German infantry had to carefully manage their ammunition, had to avoid unnecessary engagements, had to break off firefights to conserve rounds. And this created a vicious cycle for German forces, because the more they tried to conserve ammunition, the more they lost tactical initiative. The more they lost tactical initiative, the more they had to react to American attacks rather than launching their own operations. The more they reacted instead of attacked, the more American firepower superiority mattered, and the more American firepower superiority mattered, the faster German units were destroyed. This cycle repeated itself thousands of times across every front where American forces operated. It was most obvious in Northwest Europe, but it also applied in Italy, in the Pacific, in North Africa. Everywhere American forces fought, they brought with them an assumption of unlimited ammunition that shaped their tactics, their doctrine, and their casualty rates. And while American ammunition expenditure has been criticized by some military historians as wasteful or inefficient, the numbers tell a different story. American combat deaths per enemy killed were significantly lower than German combat deaths per enemy killed, in part because American forces could use ammunition to reduce their exposure to enemy fire. American casualties per objective captured were lower than German casualties in similar operations, again because American forces could use artillery and suppressive fire to minimize infantry exposure. The brutal mathematics of steel, not blood, worked. American forces traded ammunition for lives, and because America could produce ammunition faster than it could train replacement soldiers, this was a trade that made strategic sense. German commanders understood this. By late 1944, they knew they were not fighting American soldiers. They were fighting American factories, and you cannot win a firefight against a factory. This realization came too late to change the outcome of the war, but it would shape military thinking for decades to come. Because what America had demonstrated was that in industrial warfare, logistics is strategy. That the ability to produce and deliver ammunition can matter more than tactical skill or operational brilliance. And that if you have sufficient industrial capacity, you can design your entire military around the assumption of unlimited resources. This lesson would define American military doctrine for the next 80 years, but it would also create challenges, because not every enemy could be defeated by ammunition superiority, and not every war could be won by logistics alone. But in World War II, against Germany, unlimited ammunition was enough. It was more than enough. It was overwhelming.
The experience of World War II, and specifically the success of unlimited ammunition tactics, fundamentally changed how the United States military thought about warfare. Before World War II, American military doctrine was heavily influenced by European models, which emphasized conservation of resources, tactical elegance, and the decisive battle. After World War II, American doctrine became something unique in military history, a doctrine explicitly built around the assumption of overwhelming material superiority. This shift happened gradually, but by the late 1940s, it was formalized in U.S. Army field manuals and training programs under the concept that would later be called the American Way of War. The core idea was simple. Instead of training soldiers to conserve resources, train them to use resources decisively. Instead of emphasizing tactical efficiency, emphasize tactical effectiveness. Instead of trying to win battles with minimal expenditure, try to win battles with minimal casualties and trade material for lives whenever possible. This doctrine had several key components. First, suppressive fire became a core tactical principle. American infantry were trained to lay down heavy volumes of fire whenever they encountered enemy resistance. The goal was not necessarily to hit enemy soldiers, but to keep enemy soldiers' heads down, to suppress their ability to return fire, and to create opportunities for maneuver. This was a radical departure from European doctrine, which emphasized aimed fire and ammunition conservation. American doctrine said, fire first, fire heavily, and keep firing until the enemy is suppressed. Second, artillery became the primary casualty-producing arm of the American military, not infantry. American tactical doctrine evolved to use infantry primarily as reconnaissance and maneuver forces, while artillery did the actual work of destroying enemy positions. The ratio of artillery to infantry in American divisions increased steadily after World War II, and forward observer training became one of the most important skills for American infantry officers. The doctrine was simple. Find the enemy, fix the enemy in place, and then destroy the enemy with artillery. This minimized infantry casualties while maximizing the use of America's logistical and industrial advantages. Third, close air support became integrated into ground operations in ways that other militaries did not match. American forces developed tactics where aircraft were used essentially as flying artillery to deliver precision firepower on enemy positions that threatened ground forces. This required massive investments in training, logistics, and coordination, but it allowed American forces to bring overwhelming firepower to bear even in situations where ground-based artillery could not reach. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, American military logistics became the most sophisticated in the world. The U.S. military developed supply chains that could deliver ammunition to frontline troops faster and more reliably than any other military in history. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate doctrinal choice. American planners understood that unlimited ammunition only works if you can actually get the ammunition to the troops who need it. So they invested heavily in trucks, rail systems, air transport, forward supply depots, and the entire infrastructure of military logistics. These doctrinal changes had profound effects on how America fought wars. In Korea, American forces expended ammunition at rates that made World War II look conservative. In Vietnam, American forces fired more ammunition than in World War II, despite Vietnam being a much smaller conflict. In the Gulf War, American forces used precision-guided munitions that cost more per round than some nations spent on their entire military budgets, but delivered effects that traditional ammunition could never match. The pattern was consistent. Whenever American forces engaged in combat, they brought overwhelming firepower. They used ammunition liberally, and they traded steel for blood, and they accepted higher financial costs in exchange for lower casualty rates. But this doctrine also had costs and limitations. The financial cost of maintaining ammunition superiority was enormous. By the 1960s, the United States was spending more on military logistics and supply than most nations spent on their entire militaries. The environmental cost was also significant. American ammunition expenditure created pollution and environmental damage on scales that are still being cleaned up decades later. The strategic cost was perhaps most significant, because American doctrine assumed enemies would fight conventionally, would mass their forces, would present targets that could be destroyed with firepower. When America faced enemies who fought asymmetrically, who dispersed their forces, who avoided American firepower advantages, American doctrine became less effective. This was the lesson of Vietnam and later of Iraq and Afghanistan, that unlimited ammunition works brilliantly against conventional forces massed in defensive positions, but works much less well against insurgents who blend into civilian populations, who fight in small dispersed units, who refuse to present targets for American firepower. But despite these limitations, the core doctrine remained. American forces continued to train around the assumption of ammunition superiority, continued to emphasize firepower over maneuver, continued to use logistics as a strategic weapon. And this doctrine shaped not just American military operations, but American military culture. American soldiers expected to have ammunition available, expected to be able to call in fire support, expected to be resupplied regularly. And when those expectations were not met, when ammunition ran short, when resupply failed, when fire support was not available, American units often struggled, because the entire system was built around abundance, not scarcity. This created interesting challenges in the 21st century because while American industrial capacity remained impressive, the nature of warfare was changing. Precision-guided munitions cost exponentially more than dumb artillery shells. Fighting in urban environments made suppressive fire problematic because of civilian casualties. Irregular warfare made mass firepower less relevant because enemies avoided direct confrontation. And budget constraints, even for the United States, meant that truly unlimited ammunition was no longer feasible. But the legacy of World War II remained embedded in American military culture. The belief that ammunition superiority wins wars, the doctrine of steel not blood, the assumption that American soldiers should never have to worry about running out of ammunition. These ideas, shaped by the experience of fighting Germany, shaped by the success of unlimited ammunition tactics, remain central to how America thought about warfare. And this legacy, both the successes and the limitations, would define American military operations for generations to come. Because what World War II taught America was that if you have enough bullets, you can win any firefight. But what later wars would teach was that winning firefights does not always mean winning wars.
Beyond the statistics, beyond the doctrine, beyond the strategic analysis, there were human beings on the receiving end of American ammunition superiority, and their accounts, their letters, their diaries, and their post-war testimonies reveal the psychological and physical reality of facing unlimited firepower. These accounts paint a picture that is both tragic and illuminating. Hans Schmidt, a German infantryman who fought in France in 1944, kept a diary that was captured by American forces after his death. In the diary, he describes what it was like to face American attacks. He writes, August 12, 1944. The Americans attacked our position this morning. It began with artillery that lasted 2 hours. We counted over 1,000 shells landing in our sector alone. The earth shook continuously. The noise was so loud we could not hear each other shout. Men went mad from the shelling, huddled in their foxholes, crying. When the artillery stopped, American infantry advanced behind machine gun fire that sounded like cloth tearing. The Americans fired constantly, not aimed shots, but walls of bullets. We tried to return fire, but every time we raised our heads, bullets cracked past us. We could not establish fields of fire, could not coordinate our defense, could not do anything but hide and hope that shells missed us. By the time the Americans reached our positions, most of my company was dead or wounded. Not from direct hits, but from the sheer volume of fire. The few of us who survived surrendered immediately. There was no point in fighting anymore. Schmidt was killed 3 days later in another American attack before his diary could be sent home, but his account was typical of thousands of German soldier testimonies from the Western Front. Another German soldier, Corporal Wilhelm Hoffmann, who survived the war and was interviewed in the 1970s, described his first encounter with American forces in Normandy. He said, "We had been told that American soldiers were poorly trained, that they relied on equipment rather than skill, that a disciplined German unit could defeat larger American forces. The first time we engaged Americans, we learned how wrong this was. The Americans did not maneuver the way we expected. They did not try to flank us with infantry. Instead, they called in artillery. We had never experienced artillery fire like that. It was not aimed at specific targets, it was area fire, designed to saturate our entire position with explosives. The shelling went on for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 or 30 minutes. When it stopped, we had lost half our men, and the survivors were so shaken they could barely function. Then American infantry advanced, and they were firing constantly. Their machine gunners fired long bursts, 50 or 100 rounds at a time. The riflemen fired at anything that moved or anything that might hide a German soldier. We tried to return fire, but we were outnumbered, outgunned, and already demoralized by the artillery. I remember thinking, this is not warfare, this is industrial slaughter. These accounts reveal something that strategic analysis often misses: the psychological impact of facing overwhelming firepower. German soldiers had been trained in a military culture that valued discipline, courage, and tactical skill. They had been taught that these qualities could overcome material disadvantages, that a well-trained soldier was worth several poorly trained enemies, that willpower and determination mattered more than resources. But American ammunition superiority made all of these beliefs irrelevant. No amount of courage could protect you from an artillery barrage. No amount of tactical skill mattered when the enemy could afford to simply saturate your position with fire. No amount of determination helped when you were outnumbered 10-1 in ammunition, even if you were equal in manpower. This created a profound sense of helplessness that recurs in German accounts again and again. One German officer captured in late 1944 told his interrogators the worst part was not the casualties, or even the defeats, it was the feeling that nothing we did mattered. We could dig better trenches, and American artillery would destroy them. We could establish better fields of fire, and American infantry would suppress us with machine gun fire. We could try to maneuver, and American observers would call in fire missions that caught us in the open. It felt like fighting a machine that never ran out of ammunition, never got tired, never had to think about conservation. It just kept firing and firing and firing until we were all dead or captured. Perhaps the most haunting account comes from a letter written to a German lieutenant to his family in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The letter was never sent because the lieutenant was killed before it could be mailed, but it was found on his body by American soldiers and later translated. The letter reads, "My dear family, I do not know if I will survive to send this letter, but I must write it because I must tell someone what I have seen, what I have experienced in this war. I have fought in Poland, in France, in Russia. I have seen terrible things. I have done terrible things, but nothing prepared me for fighting the Americans. The Americans do not fight the way other armies fight. They do not rely on tactics or skill or bravery. They simply bury you in steel and fire. I watched an American artillery barrage today that lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of continuous shelling on a position held by perhaps 200 German soldiers. When the shelling stopped, there was nothing left. No trenches, no buildings, no trees, just craters and bodies. The Americans then advanced and captured the position without firing a shot because there was no one left alive to resist. This is how they fight. They use their factories, their industry, their unlimited resources to make warfare into something mechanical, something where human qualities do not matter. I realize now that we cannot win this war. We are fighting the American economy, and you cannot shoot an economy. You cannot outmaneuver a factory. You cannot defeat production with courage. All you can do is die and wait for it to end. These accounts, human and personal and tragic, reveal the other side of American ammunition superiority, the side that does not appear in logistics reports or tactical manuals. For every American life saved by suppressive fire, there was a German soldier cowering in a foxhole, waiting to die. For every American casualty prevented by artillery, there were German soldiers buried alive in collapsed bunkers. For every successful American advance, there were German units destroyed, not in glorious combat, but in grinding mechanical slaughter. And while it is important to remember that these German soldiers were fighting for a regime that committed unprecedented atrocities, that started a war of aggression, that murdered millions of innocent people, it is also important to understand the human reality of what unlimited ammunition meant in practice. Because that human reality, the psychological and physical experience of facing overwhelming firepower, would become relevant again in later American wars, when American firepower was turned against other enemies, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. And understanding what it felt like to be on the receiving end of American ammunition superiority helps us understand both the power and the limitations of that doctrine. Because while unlimited ammunition can destroy enemy forces, it cannot always win wars. And while firepower can break enemy morale, it cannot always achieve political objectives. But in World War II, against Germany, these limitations did not matter. Because the strategic objective was clear and simple: the total defeat of Nazi Germany. And for that objective, unlimited ammunition was exactly the right tool. It was overwhelming, it was decisive, and it worked.
So how did America actually do it? How did a nation that in 1939 had an army smaller than Romania's become by 1944 the most well-supplied military in human history? The answer is one of the most remarkable logistic stories in history, and it began long before Pearl Harbor. In 1939, with France collapsing and Britain under siege, President Roosevelt gave a speech where he declared that America must become the arsenal of democracy. This was not just rhetoric, it was a statement of strategic intent. Roosevelt understood that if America was going to enter the war, and increasingly it looked like America would have no choice, the U.S. military would need supplies on a scale never before seen. And that meant transforming American industry from peacetime production to wartime production on a scale and at a speed that had never been attempted. The transformation began with ammunition. American peacetime ammunition production in 1939 was approximately 12 million rounds per year, enough to supply training and maintain stockpiles for a small professional army, but nowhere near enough for a multi-million-man force engaged in global warfare. So the U.S. government began building new ammunition plants, expanding existing facilities, converting civilian factories to military production, and investing billions of dollars in what would become the largest ammunition production system in history. By 1941, before America even entered the war, American ammunition production had increased to over 1 billion rounds per year. By 1942, it had increased to 5 billion rounds per year. By 1943, it reached 10 billion rounds per year. And by 1944, American factories were producing over 15 billion rounds of ammunition annually. This was a more than 100-fold increase in production in just 5 years. To put that in perspective, imagine if you were producing 100 widgets per day on January 1st, and by December 31st of the same year, you were producing 10,000 widgets per day. That level of scaling up is what American industry achieved. But production was only half the challenge. The other half was logistics.
actually getting the ammunition from factories in America to soldiers fighting in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. This required building a global supply chain from scratch. American logistics planners had to solve problems that had never been solved before. How do you transport millions of tons of ammunition across oceans? How do you store it safely in forward areas? How do you distribute it to units in combat? How do you track inventory across multiple theaters? How do you ensure that frontline troops never run out, while also not creating massive vulnerable stockpiles? The solutions they developed became the foundation for modern military logistics. First, they built a transportation system specifically for military supplies. The U.S. military expanded the merchant marine to over 5,000 ships, built hundreds of cargo plants, created the Red Ball Express and other truck convoy systems, and established supply depots on every continent. American logistics officers calculated that to keep one American soldier supplied in combat required approximately 0.8 tons of supplies per day. Most of that was ammunition, fuel, and food. Multiplied across millions of soldiers, that meant moving millions of tons of supplies every single day. Second, they developed standardized packaging and handling systems. Ammunition was packaged in standardized crates that could be loaded and unloaded quickly, transported efficiently, and stored safely. This sounds simple, but it required redesigning packaging systems, coordinating across thousands of suppliers, and training millions of logistics personnel. Third, they created a distribution system that could respond to changing combat conditions. American logistics was not just about moving supplies from point A to point B. It was about dynamically responding to where supplies were needed most. During the Battle of the Bulge, for example, American logistics officers redirected the entire supply system of the European theater within 48 hours. Truck convoys that were heading to rear areas were turned around and sent to the Ardennes. Ammunition that was stockpiled for future operations was rushed to the front. Supplies that were still being unloaded from ships in Antwerp were immediately loaded onto trucks and driven directly to combat units. This flexibility, this ability to surge supplies to where they were needed most, was unprecedented in military history. Fourth, they invested in infrastructure, building roads, repairing railways, constructing airfields, establishing supply depots, and creating the physical infrastructure needed to support a global logistics system. American engineers built thousands of miles of roads in Europe, repaired damaged railways, constructed fuel pipelines, and established supply networks that are still used today. But perhaps most importantly, American logistics planners thought of ammunition not as a scarce resource to be carefully rationed, but as a weapon to be used decisively. This mindset shift was revolutionary. Most militaries treated logistics as a support function, something that enabled combat operations but was separate from combat. American logistics planners understood that in industrial warfare, logistics is combat, that the ability to deliver ammunition to the front is just as important as the ability to fire it accurately. This led to innovations like forward ammunition dumps, located close to front lines, where units could quickly resupply. Containerized ammunition that could be transferred from trucks to artillery positions in minutes. Pre-packaged ammunition loads organized by unit type, so infantry units got infantry ammunition mixes and artillery units got artillery ammunition mixes. And just-in-time delivery systems, where ammunition was delivered based on predicted consumption rates rather than fixed schedules. These innovations meant that American units in combat rarely worried about running out of ammunition. And when they did run low, resupply was usually available within hours, not days. The contrast with German logistics was stark. German supply system was based on railways, which were vulnerable to air attack and required captured rail infrastructure to be repaired before supplies could move forward. German trucks were a mix of hundreds of different models, many captured from occupied countries, which made maintenance and spare parts a nightmare. German fuel shortages meant that even when supplies were available, trucks often could not deliver them because there was no fuel. And German logistics planning assumed scarcity, so even when supplies were available, they were often rationed or held back for future operations rather than used immediately.
American logistics, by contrast, was based on trucks, which could operate on roads or cross-country, was standardized around a few reliable models, like the GMC CCKW and the Studebaker US6, had fuel available in abundance thanks to American oil production, and assumed abundance, so supplies were pushed forward to units as quickly as possible, rather than carefully rationed. The result was that American soldiers fought knowing they would be resupplied. German soldiers fought knowing they might not be. And this psychological difference, this confidence in logistics, shaped how both armies fought. American units could be aggressive, could take risks, could expand ammunition freely because they knew more was coming. German units had to be cautious, had to conserve, had to always think about what they would do when supplies ran out. And in the end, this logistic superiority, this ability to move supplies faster and more efficiently than any military in history, was just as important to American victory as any tactical innovation or technological advantage. Because wars are not just won by fighting battles, they are won by sustaining armies in the field. And in World War II, America sustained its armies better than any nation in history.
To truly understand the impact of American ammunition superiority, it's useful to compare the Western Front, where American forces fought with unlimited ammunition, to the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces fought with limited ammunition against the same German enemy. The contrasts are illuminating. On the Eastern Front, from 1941 to 1945, Soviet forces faced many of the same tactical challenges that American forces faced: how to break through prepared German defenses, how to advance against determined German resistance, how to minimize casualties while maximizing enemy losses. But Soviet forces faced these challenges with very different resources. Soviet ammunition production was substantial. The Soviet Union produced approximately 17 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during World War II, more than Germany, but far less than America. And Soviet logistics were much less efficient than American logistics. Soviet supply lines were long, vulnerable to German attack, and often disrupted. Soviet trucks were less reliable. Soviet roads were worse, and Soviet logistics planning was less sophisticated. As a result, Soviet forces often experienced ammunition shortages, even when overall production was sufficient. Soviet infantry units sometimes ran out of ammunition in the middle of battles. Soviet artillery batteries were rationed to far fewer shells per day than American batteries, and Soviet resupply was often delayed or failed to arrive at all. This meant that Soviet tactical doctrine evolved differently than American doctrine. Soviet forces could not rely on unlimited ammunition, so they could not use American-style suppressive fire or overwhelming artillery barrages. Instead, Soviet doctrine emphasized mass assaults, using numerical superiority to overwhelm German positions, accepting high casualties in exchange for territorial gains. Soviet doctrine also emphasized artillery concentrations, massing large numbers of guns to deliver short, intensive barrages rather than sustained fire missions. And Soviet doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, using tanks, infantry, and artillery together to achieve breakthroughs, rather than relying primarily on firepower. The results were dramatically different. Casualty rates: Soviet forces in World War II suffered approximately 11 million military deaths compared to approximately 300,000 American military deaths in all theaters. Part of this disparity was due to the fact that the Eastern Front was larger, longer, and more intense than the Western Front. But part of it was also due to the fact that Soviet forces could not use firepower to minimize casualties the way American forces could. Soviet infantry had to assault positions that American infantry could suppress with machine gun fire. Soviet forces had to accept casualties in frontal assaults that American forces could avoid by calling in artillery. Soviet soldiers died in situations where American soldiers would have used ammunition instead of blood. And German forces on the Eastern Front noticed this difference. Captured German soldiers who had fought on both fronts consistently reported that the Eastern Front was more intense, involved more close combat, and resulted in higher casualties on both sides, but that the Western Front was more psychologically devastating because of American firepower. One German officer,
who had commanded a battalion in Russia in 1943 and then a battalion in France in 1944, said in his interrogation, "In Russia, we feared Soviet numerical superiority, Soviet tanks, and Soviet winter. But we also knew that if we fought skillfully, if we used terrain advantage, if we maintained fire discipline, we could win engagements even when outnumbered. In France, against the Americans, we had no such confidence. American firepower was so overwhelming that tactical skill became almost irrelevant. It did not matter how well we positioned our troops or how carefully we planned our defenses. The Americans would simply call in artillery and obliterate our positions." This contrast highlights an important point about American ammunition superiority. It was not just about the quantity of ammunition, it was about the entire system. Logistics, doctrine, training, technology, all working together to make ammunition a war-winning weapon. Soviet forces had substantial ammunition production, but could not match American logistics. American forces had not just more ammunition, but better ways of delivering it to the front and better tactical doctrine for using it effectively. And this combination of production, logistics, and doctrine is what made American ammunition superiority so decisive. But the Eastern Front comparison also reveals something else, that unlimited ammunition, while powerful, has limitations. Soviet forces, despite their ammunition shortages, despite their higher casualties, despite their less sophisticated logistics, still defeated Germany on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces destroyed more German divisions, captured more German soldiers, and advanced farther into German territory than American forces. This suggests that while ammunition superiority is important, it is not the only factor that matters in warfare. Soviet numerical superiority, Soviet strategic depth, Soviet willingness to accept casualties, Soviet political will, all of these factors mattered, and in some ways mattered more than ammunition in the grand strategic outcome of the war. This is an important lesson because it suggests that while American ammunition doctrine worked brilliantly in World War II, it might not work as well against enemies who can match American production, or who can avoid American firepower advantages, or who are willing to accept casualty rates that American society would not tolerate. And indeed, this would be the lesson of later American wars. Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan all demonstrated that unlimited ammunition, while still important, does not guarantee victory against all types of enemies. But in World War II, against Germany on the Western Front, American ammunition superiority was decisive. It allowed American forces to advance rapidly, to minimize casualties, to break German resistance, and ultimately to achieve total victory. And the contrast with the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces achieved similar strategic objectives but at much higher human cost, demonstrates the value of the American approach. Steel, not blood. Ammunition instead of lives. Firepower instead of frontal assault. This was the American way of war, and in World War II, it worked brilliantly.
The lessons of unlimited ammunition in World War II shaped American military doctrine for the next 80 years and continue to influence how America thinks about warfare today. But the legacy is complicated, because while World War II demonstrated that ammunition superiority can win wars, later conflicts demonstrated that ammunition superiority alone is not enough. In Korea, American forces again enjoyed massive ammunition superiority over Chinese and North Korean forces. American artillery fired millions of shells. American aircraft dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs. American infantry used ammunition at rates similar to World War II. But Korea ended in stalemate, not victory. American firepower destroyed enemy formations, broke enemy attacks, and inflicted heavy casualties, but it could not achieve the political objective of reunifying Korea under a democratic government. This was the first hint that unlimited ammunition, while still valuable, might not be sufficient against all enemies. In Vietnam, the pattern repeated. American forces expended more ammunition in Vietnam than in World War II. American artillery fired over 40 million shells. American aircraft dropped over 7 million tons of bombs. American forces used firepower on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before. But Vietnam ended in American withdrawal. American firepower killed hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, destroyed enemy infrastructure, and dominated the battlefield, but it could not achieve the political objective of reunifying Korea under a democratic government. These experiences forced American military thinkers to grapple with uncomfortable questions. What do you do when your enemy refuses to mass forces and present targets for your firepower? What do you do when unlimited ammunition can destroy enemy forces, but cannot achieve political objectives? What do you do when the cost of ammunition superiority, both financial and political, becomes prohibitive? These questions led to evolution in American doctrine. The development of precision-guided munitions tried to address the problem of enemies who dispersed and hit among civilians. If you could hit exactly what you aimed at, you did not need to fire as many rounds, and you reduced collateral damage. The development of counterinsurgency doctrine tried to address the problem of enemies who fought asymmetrically. If firepower alone could not win, then you needed to combine firepower with political, economic, and social strategies. The development of network-centric warfare tried to use information technology to make firepower more effective by improving targeting, reducing the time from detection to engagement, and increasing the efficiency of ammunition expenditure. But even with these evolutions, the core assumption remained. American forces are still the best supplied military in the world. American logistics are still the most sophisticated. American ammunition expenditure in combat is still higher than any other military. And American doctrine still emphasizes using firepower to minimize casualties. The idea of steel, not blood, the concept that you can trade ammunition for lives, the belief that logistics is strategy, all of these ideas born in World War II, tested against Germany, proven on the battlefields of Europe, remain central to how America thinks about warfare. And while future conflicts may challenge these assumptions, may force further evolution in doctrine, may require new approaches to old problems, the fundamental lesson remains. If you have the industrial capacity to produce unlimited ammunition and the logistical capacity to deliver it to your forces, then ammunition itself becomes a weapon. And if you use that weapon effectively, you can change the nature of warfare. This was the lesson that German commanders learned too late. This was the reality that broke German military power. And this was the legacy that shaped American military doctrine for generations.
So let's return to where we began, December 1944, that German officer in the Ardennes Forest, listening to American machine guns firing continuously into the night. What was going through his mind in that moment? He was realizing something profound, something that would echo through the remaining months of the war and influence military thinking for decades to come. He was realizing that Germany had lost, not because German soldiers were less brave, not because German tactics were inferior, not even because German technology was inadequate. Germany had lost because they were fighting American industry, and you cannot win a firefight against a factory. This realization, the understanding that warfare in the industrial age is ultimately about production capacity, about logistics, about the ability to sustain forces in the field with unlimited supplies, this realization was devastating to German commanders because it meant that everything they had been taught, everything they believed about warfare was wrong, or at least insufficient. Tactical brilliance did not matter when your enemy had unlimited ammunition. Operational excellence did not matter when your enemy could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. Strategic genius did not matter when your enemy could outproduce you 10-1 in every category of war material. The numbers tell the story, but they do not capture the human reality. 47 billion rounds of American ammunition versus 15 billion rounds of German ammunition.
1 billion American artillery shells versus 300 million German artillery shells. 2,000 tons of supplies per day for American divisions versus 500 tons per day for German divisions. These were not just statistics. These were the measurements of industrial capacity turned into a weapon. And the effect was not just physical, it was psychological. German soldiers in late 1944 and early 1945 fought knowing they would lose, knowing that no matter how bravely they fought or how skillfully they maneuvered, they would eventually be buried under an avalanche of American steel. This knowledge, this certainty of defeat, was perhaps more destructive to German combat effectiveness than the ammunition itself, because it broke the will to fight in ways that tactical defeats alone could not. One of the captured German officers we quoted earlier said something that captures this perfectly. He said, "We knew we were going to lose when we heard American machine guns firing continuously for hours at night, at nothing, just at suspected positions, just to keep us afraid. The sound of American guns firing endlessly into the darkness, that was when we knew Germany had lost the war." This statement reveals the psychological dimension of unlimited ammunition. It was not just about killing enemy soldiers, it was about demonstrating that you had resources so vast that you did not need to conserve them, that you could afford to waste ammunition just to create a psychological effect, that you were fighting an enemy that operated under completely different assumptions about warfare. And those different assumptions, those American assumptions, were products of American geography, American resources, American industrial capacity, and American strategic culture. America had the space, the resources, the factories, and the workforce to produce ammunition on a scale that no other nation could match. America had the oceans protecting its industrial base from enemy attack, which meant American factories could operate at full capacity without interruption. America had the logistics infrastructure, the trucks, the ships, the organizational capacity to deliver ammunition from factories to battlefields across the globe. And perhaps most importantly, America had a strategic culture that valued minimizing casualties, that saw ammunition expenditure as a cost-effective way to save American lives, that was willing to spend money on steel to avoid spending lives in blood. All of these factors came together in World War II to create a military doctrine that was uniquely American and uniquely effective against conventional enemies like Germany. Steel, not blood, firepower over maneuver, logistics as strategy, unlimited ammunition as a weapon. These were the principles that won World War II for America, and these are the principles that continue to shape American military doctrine today. But the story also carries a warning, because while unlimited ammunition worked brilliantly against Germany, it did not work as well against other enemies in other contexts. Vietnam demonstrated that you cannot bomb an insurgency into submission, that unlimited ammunition cannot achieve political objectives if the enemy refuses to fight conventionally. Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrated that you cannot use firepower to build nations, that winning battles is not the same as winning wars, and future conflicts against peer competitors may challenge American ammunition superiority in ways that Vietnam and Iraq did not. If an enemy can disrupt American logistics, can threaten American supply lines, can force American forces to fight without resupply, then the entire doctrine of unlimited ammunition collapses. These are real challenges, and they require American military planners to think carefully about the future, but they do not diminish the historical importance of what happened in World War II, or the lessons that can be learned from it by studying it. In World War II, American unlimited ammunition broke German military power, crushed German tactical advantages, and proved that in industrial warfare, production capacity matters more than tactical skill. This lesson, uncomfortable as it might be to those who prefer to think of warfare as a contest of courage and skill, is nonetheless true, and it remains relevant today. So when we look back at those German commanders laughing at American wasteful ammunition usage in 1942 and 1943, when we see their confidence that German tactical superiority would overcome American material advantages, when we read their dismissive comments about American military effectiveness, we should remember what happened next. We should remember that by 1945, those same German commanders were surrendering to American forces, were sitting in prisoner of war camps, were watching their nation occupied and divided, and were trying to explain to interrogators how they had lost the war. And in those explanations, again and again, the same theme emerged. We were not defeated by American soldiers, we were defeated by American factories. We were not outfought, we were outproduced. We did not lose battles, we lost the industrial war. This is the final lesson of unlimited ammunition in World War II. That in modern warfare, industrial capacity is combat power. That logistics is strategy, that the ability to produce and deliver ammunition can matter more than the ability to use it skillfully, and that when one nation can produce 47 billion bullets and deliver them to soldiers who use them without concern for conservation, while another nation struggles to produce 15 billion bullets and must carefully ration every round, the outcome is inevitable. The nation with more bullets wins. It is that simple and that profound. And that is why German commanders who laughed at American wasteful ammunition usage in 1942 and 1943 were in prison camps by 1945, having learned too late that what looked like waste was actually overwhelming industrial might, that what seemed like inefficiency was actually a war-winning strategy, and that you cannot defeat an enemy who has unlimited ammunition when you are counting every bullet. This was their mistake, this was their defeat, and this was America's victory.
So that's the untold story of how unlimited ammunition became America's secret weapon in World War II. If you found this fascinating, hit that subscribe button because we post new World War II stories twice a week. And trust me, the next video is even more shocking. It's about what happened when German POWs saw American supermarkets for the first time and realized the true scale of American industrial might. You will not believe their reactions. Click the video on screen now and I'll see you there. Also, drop a comment below. What other American advantages in World War II do you want us to cover? Thanks for watching. And remember, history is written by those who learn from it.